Frances Watkins Harper, who became known as the Bronze Muse, was a woman who used her voice and her pen to change deep-seated beliefs in a pro-slavery society. In her time, she stood shoulder to shoulder with abolitionist and suffragist icons of the day: Frederick Douglass, Horace Greeley, Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, Lucretia Mott, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and that list goes on. Strangely, although her contribution was considerable, she was forgotten. But Frances was rediscovered by a Maryland graduate student in the 2010s. So now, let us rediscover Frances. Frances was Black and she was a woman, which were two strikes against her in the mid-1800s. But Frances' vision was forward-seeking. For her, there was no helpless shrug, no, well, what can one person do? She knew her worth and had confidence in her talents. Frances saw what she could do, and she did it. Considering the times, how did she come to this understanding in the first place? Frances Watkins was born on September 24, 1852, to free Black parents in Baltimore, Maryland. At the time, Maryland was a slave state with a high population of free Black people. When she was 3 years of age and upon the death of both parents, she became an orphan. Frances was thereafter raised by her free Black aunt and uncle, Henrietta and Reverend William Watkins Sr. William Watkins Sr. was an interesting person. He studied medicine and treated patients. He was an active pastor for his congregation, a civil rights activist, and a prolific anti-slavery writer and speaker. And he was passionate about education. Being the forward-thinking, educated man that he was, at the age of 19, he founded the respected Watkins Academy for Negro youth. As one student said of the academy, William was strict from the first letter in the alphabet down to the last paragraph in the highest reader. The school taught English grammar, reading, writing, natural philosophy, music, and mathematics. The academy was known for setting tough expectations for its students. To what purpose are books being multiplied and put into the hands of our children unless they are able to read them? I mean read them, not mechanically, as is too much the case, but understanding. A quote by William Watkins Sr. Being raised and mentored by the Watkins family meant Frances received a challenging education at the Watkins Academy. She studied there until the age of 13, when it was expected she would go into service, which she did. Surprisingly, she was able to continue educating herself. At 13, Frances found work as a seamstress. Additionally, she worked as a nursemaid for a Quaker family who owned a bookshop. She was able to use her downtime to read the books in their shop. Already a good writer, Frances continued writing in her spare time. At the age of 20, this young Black woman published her first book of collected poetry, Forest Leaves. Frances Watkins lived an incredible life. Not only was she the first African American woman to publish a short story, but she was also a passionate abolitionist, suffragist, popular speaker, and social reformer. In the 19th century, she was a household name. She married Fenton Harper, became a stepmother to 3 children, and had a biological daughter, Mary. 4 years after her marriage, her husband died. We could continue with data from Frances' life, her travels, her speaking engagements. There is still much to tell about her dynamic life, but let's get to know her through her own words. 100 years before Rosa Parks. Here we have an excerpt from a letter from Frances to a friend. Now let me tell you about Pennsylvania. I have been traveling nearly 4 years and have been in every New England state, in New York, Canada, and Ohio. But of all these places, this is about the meanest of all as far as the treatment of colored people is concerned. I have been insulted in several railroad cars. The other day, in attempting to ride in one of the city cars after I had entered, the conductor came to me and wanted me to go out on the platform. Now, was not that brave and noble? As a matter of course, I did not. Someone interfered and asked or requested that I might be permitted to sit in a corner. I did not move but kept the same seat. When I was about to leave, he refused my money and I threw it down on the car floor and got out after I had ridden as far as I wished. Such impudence. As an educated, published author, poet, and speaker, it must have rankled Frances to know that in some states, black people, free or slaves, were not allowed to read or write. Indeed, there were harsh penalties if blacks were to risk becoming literate. Hear from the Boston Liberator in 1839. In Virginia, should free Negroes or their children assemble at a school to learn reading or writing, any justice of the peace may dismiss the school with 20 stripes on the back of every pupil. In Louisiana, the penalty for instructing a free black in Sunday school is, for the first offense, $500. For the second offense, death. During slavery, literacy among slaves was viewed as a key to freedom. After emancipation, literacy was viewed as the road to economic independence and self-empowerment. Frances became the public voice for the voiceless. In Frances' poem, Learning to Read, her character Chloe shares the experience. Learning to read. Very soon the Yankee teachers came down and set up school. But oh, how the Rebs did hate it. It was again their rule. Our masters always tried to hide book learning from our eyes. Knowledge didn't agree with slavery. It would make us all too wise. But some of us would try to steal a little from the book and put the words together and learn by hook or crook. I remember Uncle Caldwell, who took pot liquor fat and greased the pages of his book and hid it in his hat. And had his master ever seen the leaves upon his head, he'd have thought them greasy papers, but nothing to be read. And there was Mr. Turner's Ben, who heard the children spell and picked the words right up by heart and learned to read 'em well. Well, the northern folks kept sending the Yankee teachers down, and they stood right up and helped us, though Rebs did sneer and frown. And I longed to read my Bible, for precious words it said, but when I began to learn it, folks just shook their heads and said, there is no use in trying. Oh, Chloe, you're too late. That as I was rising 60, I had no time to wait. So I got a pair of glasses and straight to work I went, and never stopped till I could read the hymns and testament. Then I got a little cabin, a place to call my own, and I felt independent as the queen upon her throne. Baltimore's free blacks lived among enslaved black people and witnessed the humiliation and barbarism under which slaves lived. Frances both wrote and spoke about the inhuman conditions of slavery, and she was reported to be a fiery, non-compromising speaker. Through her speaking engagements and writings, she held up slavery abuses to the eyes of the everyday person. On the left, we have Gordon, also known as Whipped Peter, who was a slave owned by Louisiana plantation owners John and Bridget Lyons. Peter reported that it took 2 months to heal from the whipping by Lyon's overseer. Although the overseer was fired, he was of course not arrested. Peter was told that during part of his recovery he was out of his mind from the whipping experience. He eventually escaped the plantation and joined the Union Army. Another horrible abuse was separating children from their parents so the kids could be sold to another slaver. Frances depicted this cruelty in her poem, The Slave Mother. The Slave Mother. Heard you that shriek? It rose so wildly on the air, it seemed as if a burdened heart was breaking in despair. Saw you those hands so sadly clasped, the bowed and feeble head, the shuddering of that fragile form, that look of grief and dread? Saw you the sad, imploring eye? Its every glance was pain, as if a storm of agony were sweeping through the brain. She is a mother, pale with fear. Her boy clings to her side, and in her kirtle vainly tries his trembling form to hide. He is not hers, although she bore for him a mother's pains. He is not hers, although her blood is coursing through his veins. He is not hers, for cruel hands may rudely tear apart the only wreath of household love that binds her breaking heart. His love has been a joyous light that o'er her pathway smiled, a fountain gushing ever new amid life's desert wild. His lightest word has been a tone of music round her heart, their lives a streamlet blent in one. O Father, must they part? They tear him from her circling arms, her last and fond embrace. Oh, never more may her sad eyes gaze on his mournful face. No marvel then these bitter shrieks disturb the listening air. She is a mother, and her heart is breaking in despair. And on the right we have an example of this. For sale, a remarkable, smart, healthy Negro wench, about 22 years of age, used to both housework and farming, and sold for no fault but for want of employment. She is a child about 9 months old, which will be at the purchaser's option. In another poem, The Slave Auction, Frances speaks again of the horror of separating children and parents. Here is an excerpt from that poem. And mothers stood with streaming eyes and saw their dearest children sold. Unheeded rose their bitter cries while tyrants bartered them for gold. And on the right, we see an example of people later trying to find their children. Information wanted of my husband and son. We parted at Richmond, Virginia in 1860. My son's name was James Monroe Holmes. My husband's name was Frank Holmes. My son was sold in Richmond, Virginia. I don't know where they carried him to. My husband was not sold. I left him in Richmond, Virginia, and I and 5 children, Henry, Gabrielle, Charles, Dorotha, and Jacob, were sold to a trader who lived in Texas. I am now old and don't think that I shall be here long and would like to see them before I die. Any information concerning them will be thankfully received by Eliza Holmes, Flatonia, Fayette County, Texas. Such abuse remains deep-seated among some. This from a 2018 Chicago Tribune article by Russell Contreras on the United States history of parent-child separation. White House Press Secretary Sarah Huckabee Sanders and Attorney Jeff Sessions cited the Bible in defending the policy of forced separation of Latino migrant children. Sessions referenced Romans 13, which urges readers to obey the laws of the government because God has ordained them for the purpose of order. The same passage was cited before the Civil War to justify slavery, to allow slave hunters to return runaway slaves to their owners, and to pull slave children away from mothers. Here's another example, a report from Anne C. Bailey, author and professor of history at New York State University. Here below is an affidavit of an immigrant mother seeking asylum at the border, being separated from her child. My son was crying as I put him in the seat. I did not even have a chance to try to comfort my son because the officer slammed the door shut as soon as he was in his seat. I was crying too. I cry even now when I think about that moment when the border officers took my son away. Frances Harper and her contemporaries created a disruption and made significant culture-changing contributions, but since that time we have not cleaned our house well. For those of us who have been given much, we do not need to find our voice. We already have a voice. Silence has no voice, and silence is a choice. Frances made her choice. She was not silent. She went into the world and became the voice of the voiceless, and she made a nation listen. Frances was a passionate suffragist, but died 9 years before she could see women get the vote. Sadly, she was preceded in death by her daughter Mary. On her gravestone, from her poem, "Bury me in a free land," I ask no monument proud and high to arrest the gaze of the passers-by. All that my yearning spirit craves is bury me not in a land of slaves.